The winter in Montana was not kind. The icy early mornings covered Ethan Walker's ranch with a thick layer of snow, making every step a challenge and every breath of air a cruel reminder of his loneliness. He woke before the sun, not by choice, but because his body refused to rest. PTSD turned every night into a lost battle, and when the first beam of light pierced the window of his small wooden house, he was already on the porch, holding a mug of cold coffee, watching the horizon without truly seeing it. The ranch was both his fortress and his prison. The silence of the countryside should have been a relief after the years spent in combat zones, but for Ethan, the silence was deafening. That morning, however, something different broke his routine. Flipping through the local newspaper more out of habit than interest, his eyes fixed on a short, almost insignificant ad that hit him like a punch to the chest. Retired military dog available for auction. German Shepherd. Aggressive. History. Requires specialized handling. If not sold, will be euthanized. He reread those words 3 times. He knew what happened to military dogs when they were no longer useful. He had seen it before, on missions where 4-legged companions, loyal to the end, were discarded without ceremony when they became a burden. His mind, trained to assess situations and risks, tried to rationalize, but something inside him, something beyond logic, made him decide. He didn't know exactly why, but he needed to be at that auction. The auction would take place at a discreet facility on the outskirts of Billings, the nearest town with any structure. It was one of those events that didn't appear on the news and that only a select group of interested parties knew about. Ethan drove for hours, crossing deserted roads and mountainous stretches with fine snow beginning to cover the asphalt. The car radio was off, and the only sound in the cabin was his own breathing. He wasn't exactly sure what he expected to find. Perhaps a bunch of breeders and trainers trying to buy the animal at the lowest possible price, or maybe some farmer in search of a cheap guard dog. What he did know was that the fate of that German Shepherd was practically sealed, unless someone did something. And he had already decided that that someone would be him. When he arrived, the facility was exactly as he imagined. A metal shed, isolated from the town, with few cars in the dirt parking lot. Upon entering, the smell of cheap dog food and rust mingled with the biting winter cold. A few stern-looking men were scattered about, evaluating the few dogs available. Most seemed unconcerned, speaking softly, exchanging looks that Ethan recognized from afar. They were the type who saw animals as tools, nothing more. In a reinforced metal pen, at the back of the shed, there it was, the German Shepherd, taller than Ethan expected, its body marked by scars, with darkened fur and a gaze that fixed on nothing. The dog was motionless, but it wasn't submission. It was something else, as if it were waiting for the worst, yet ready to react. As soon as Ethan approached the fence, the beast's eyes turned to him, and for a brief moment, something in the dog's gaze made his chest tighten. It wasn't fear, it was weariness. Ethan stood there, frozen before the fence, watching the dog. Other buyers passed by, casting quick glances, evaluating muscles, posture, perhaps already calculating if they could tame him. But no one truly stopped. It was as if the animal was already condemned, and that auction was just a formality before the end. Ethan recognized that look in the German Shepherd's eyes. He had seen many soldiers with that same emptiness in their gaze, men who returned from war without truly coming back. The only difference was that for the men, there was therapy, support groups, treatments, even if many refused. For the dogs, there was only one way out. He overheard one of the organizers comment to a potential buyer, "That one is a lost cause, 0 chance of rehabilitation. That's why we call him Zero." Ethan felt his jaw lock. The name hit hard, as if it sealed the animal's fate. Zero, as if it meant nothing, as if he had never existed. But he did exist, and judging by the scars and posture, he had already been through hell and back more than once. The auction began shortly after. Other dogs were presented first, trained, disciplined, easy to sell. They were quickly snapped up with bids, rising fast, followed by handshakes and satisfied smiles. When it was the German Shepherd's turn, the silence in the shed was different. It wasn't expectation, it was indifference. The auctioneer made his introduction without enthusiasm. Zero, German Shepherd, retired from military service, aggressive history, untrainable, recommended only for professionals. The looks around were the same, cold, uninterested. The first bid was low. A man at the back raised his hand, offering a symbolic amount, almost mockingly. The auctioneer waited, looked around, and no one else seemed eager to compete. Ethan took a deep breath, raised his hand, and said a higher number. The auctioneer's look changed slightly, surprised that someone was actually interested. The man at the back, perhaps just to provoke, covered Ethan's bid with another amount, smiling slyly. But Ethan wasn't there to play games. He raised his hand again, stating a number no one expected to hear. The shed fell silent for a moment. The auctioneer waited, looked around, but no further bids came. Sold. Ethan filled out the paperwork without saying a word. The auction organizer seemed indifferent, merely fulfilling his duty before getting rid of a problem. "Good luck with him," he murmured, shoving the documents in Ethan's direction. "You won't get close without him trying to tear your hand off." Ethan didn't reply. He simply took the papers, signed where needed, and proceeded to the transport area. The dog was being removed from the pen by two men, both wearing thick gloves and holding restraint leads. Zero growled low but did not struggle. He knew that resistance would only make things worse. Another thing Ethan recognized. He had seen that kind of behavior before in captured soldiers. The resigned acceptance of someone who had already understood that fighting was pointless. One of the men looked at Ethan, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this? This one should have been sacrificed a long time ago." Ethan looked at Zero and then at the man. "Put him in my car." The drive back was silent. Zero sat in the back seat, still on the leash, lying in the furthest corner possible, watching every move Ethan made with alert eyes, without showing any trace of trust or curiosity, only vigilance. The engine rumbled low as they crossed the snow-covered road. Ethan kept one hand firmly on the steering wheel, but his mind was far away. Something about that animal affected him in a way he couldn't yet explain. It wasn't just compassion or an irrational desire to save him. It was something deeper, as if by rescuing that dog, he was rescuing a part of himself that had been left behind on some distant battlefield. He didn't know if he could win the animal's trust. He didn't even know if he could get close without being attacked. But one thing he knew, Zero would not be just another discard by the system, not while he could do something about it. The road seemed endless. The snow piled up along the sides created a white tunnel around the car, and the sound of tires cutting through the wet asphalt was the only noise, besides Ethan's controlled breathing. In the back seat, Zero remained motionless, but his eyes never stopped. He observed every move Ethan made, every change in the environment, like a soldier who never lets his guard down. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. Ethan had seen that before in men who had spent too much time in combat, who had learned the hard way that relaxing could be fatal. He wondered how many times that dog had been betrayed, how many times he had waited for a friendly hand only to be met with pain, and above all, if there was still something within him that could be saved. When they arrived at the ranch, the sky was already darkening. The cold had grown even more intense, biting, and Ethan felt the muscles in his hands tighten around the steering wheel. He parked the car near the barn and stayed for a few seconds, just breathing, thinking about the best way to get Zero out without causing a commotion. He didn't want to force him into anything. The last thing that animal needed was someone trying to control him by force. He opened the door slowly, stepping on the compacted snow, and went to the back of the car. Zero didn't move. His eyes just followed him. Ethan opened the door of the back passenger area, stepped away a little, and waited. The dog remained still. The tension was almost palpable. Then, without haste, Ethan took a step back and spoke for the first time since leaving the auction. "You come out whenever you want." Zero did not move immediately. He stayed in the same corner of the back seat, eyes fixed on Ethan, evaluating every detail. It wasn't just caution. It was a strategic decision, the same one a soldier makes when entering unknown territory. Ethan recognized that. The dog didn't trust him, but he had no other option either. For long seconds, neither moved. The cold wind cut through the air, and Ethan's breath came, out in small white clouds. Then finally, Zero made the first move. Slowly he slid out of the car, not turning his back on Ethan, as if expecting a trap. When his paws touched the snow, the dog raised his head, sniffing the air, analyzing the surroundings. Ethan did not try to approach, he only watched. If there was any chance to build trust, it would start there, respecting Zero's space. He walked slowly to the barn and opened the large wooden door, revealing a spacious area covered in hay. Hisachi's had prepared an isolated corner with a thick blanket and a bowl of clean water. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough for a first day. Ethan stepped back and waited to see if Zero would follow. The dog cast a dubious look, scanned the area, and unhurried, walked to the barn's entrance. He didn't enter immediately. First, he sniffed the wood, looked around, made sure there were no threats. Then he crossed the door and settled in the corner Ethan had prepared, with his back to the wall, where he could see everything around him. Once again, pure instinct. Ethan let out a long sigh and partially closed the barn door, leaving space for the dog to leave if he wished. Then he walked back to the house, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. Zero was there, and now it was up to him to prove that he wasn't just another human ready to disappoint. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in the living room armchair, his eyes fixed on the fireplace, where the flames danced silently. The warmth helped ward off some of the biting cold, but his mind found no rest. He picked up the whiskey bottle on the table beside him, twirled it in his hands, but didn't drink. It had been a while since he had. Alcohol helped erase memories for a few hours, but always brought back the ghosts even stronger afterward. So he simply stared at the bottle for a moment before putting it back in its place. Outside, the wind howled between the trees, and now and then, the creak of the barn's wood broke. The silence. Zero was there, a dog the world had already discarded, just like him. Ethan rubbed his face, feeling his unshaven beard scratch the palm of his hand. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but there was no turning back. In the morning, the sky was gray, and the cold even more intense. Ethan put on a thick coat before leaving. The snow made a slight crunch under his boots as he walked to the barn. He stopped at the door, took a deep breath, and opened it slowly. Zero was still there, curled up in the corner, head held high, eyes alert. He didn't growl or move, he simply watched. Ethan grabbed a bucket of feed he had brought and poured some on the ground, keeping his movements slow and measured. He also left some fresh water. Then, without saying a word, he stepped back and left. He didn't want to force anything. Trust had to be built on Zero's terms. When he was halfway back to the house, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. The dog still hadn't moved, but his eyes remained fixed on him, watching, evaluating, as if trying to understand who that man was, the first time in a long while who demanded nothing from him. The day passed slowly, as all the others had since Ethan isolated himself at that ranch. But now, there was something different. Even though Zero didn't trust him, even though there was still no bond between them, the simple presence of the animal changed the pace of his routine. Ethan noticed that, subconsciously, he was more alert to the sounds of the barn. At any movement, any sign that Zero might be trying to escape or that something was wrong. But the dog remained where he was, only coming out when he thought no one was watching. At the end of the afternoon, when Ethan returned to the barn to collect the water bowl, he noticed that the feed was gone. It was progress, small, almost insignificant, but still an advance. Without haste, he grabbed the bucket and put out more food, then stepped back again. Zero watched him from afar, but did not move. There was a distance between them that still seemed insurmountable, but Ethan did not expect miracles. He knew it would take time. As night fell, the temperature dropped even more, and a snowstorm began to form. Ethan lit the fireplace and made a strong coffee. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he knew sleep would be a problem. He didn't want to face the dreams, the memories that always came when silence took over. So he sat there, at the table, watching the dark. Liquid swirl in his cup. That was when he heard a different noise coming from outside, a low, dragging sound, as if something was moving along the porch. He frowned, set the cup aside, and got up. When he opened the door, the cold wind cut across his face, and there, standing at the edge between the snow and the wooden porch, was Zero. He didn't approach, but he also didn't run. He simply stood there, staring at Ethan as if testing him, as if to say, "I'm here." And now, Ethan didn't move. The wind whistled around the porch, carrying snowflakes that accumulated on the wooden steps. Zero remained standing there, like a shadow in the cold. His fur bristled, but showing neither fear nor aggression, just pure observation, a silent study. Ethan knew that look well. It was the same one he used when entering unfamiliar territory and needing to assess the environment before taking the next step. He could try calling him, but he knew that would be useless. He would gain much more by letting the dog decide on his own. Instead, he simply held the door open for a moment, letting the warmth of the house escape. Then, without saying anything, he turned and went back inside, leaving the door ajar. For a few minutes, Zero remained motionless. The cold didn't seem to bother him, but something inside him analyzed the situation as if it were a matter of life and death. Then slowly, he took a step forward, sniffed the warm air coming from the house, and with extreme caution, crossed the threshold. His body was tense, muscles ready to react to the slightest sign of threat. Ethan watched without moving, simply observing the animal explore this new territory. Zero didn't go far. He stopped near the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the fire, and stayed there, standing, evaluating. The warmth was probably a strange sensation for him. Perhaps the first time in a long while he wasn't out in the cold, fighting against the biting chill. Ethan picked up his coffee and sat back at the table. He didn't try to approach or force anything. He simply let the dog decide if he wanted to stay. The silence between them stretched for several minutes, broken only by the crackling of wood in the fireplace. Zero didn't completely relax, but he also didn't retreat. He maintained an alert posture, sniffing the air from time to time, as if expecting something to change at any moment. Ethan stayed seated, drinking his coffee, showing neither expectation nor impatience. He knew that trust isn't something that's rushed. In the army, he had learned that some bonds are built not through words, but by simple presence. The dog was there because he wanted to be, and that was already a start. After a while, Ethan slowly got up and walked to the closet, retrieving a thick blanket. He spread it on the floor at a safe distance from Zero without looking directly at the animal. Then he sat back down. He didn't say anything, nor make any flashy gestures. He simply offered an option. Zero watched the scene with alert eyes, analyzing every detail. He looked at Ethan, then at the blanket, and stayed where he was for a few more minutes. The survival instinct was stronger than any attempt at approach, and Ethan knew that the slightest wrong move could undo any progress. Then, without warning, Zero finally moved. He walked slowly to the blanket and lay down, keeping his gaze fixed on Ethan as if expecting it to be some kind of trick. But nothing happened. The warmth of the fireplace was real. The floor was stable, and for the first time in a long while, maybe he was safe. Ethan let out a soft sigh and finished his coffee, feeling that, even without words, an invisible barrier had been broken. The night passed without incident. Ethan slept in the armchair lightly, interrupted a few times by the crackling of wood in the fireplace or the sound of the wind outside. Zero didn't come any closer, but he also didn't try to leave. He slept with his eyes half open, on alert, ready to react to the slightest sign of danger. For Ethan, that said a lot about the life the dog had led before arriving there. A soldier never lets his guard down completely in hostile territory, and for Zero, the whole world was still hostile. When the first light of morning entered through the window, Ethan opened his eyes and saw that Zero was already awake, watching him. For a second, the two just stared at each other. Then, without making any noise, the German shepherd got up, stretched slowly, and walked to the door. Ethan got the message. He got up, unlocked the door, and opened it. Zero left without hesitation, without looking back, but without showing any fear, just the instinct of an animal that still wasn't sure if it could trust. Ethan didn't force anything. He let Zero follow his own pace. He went to the kitchen, made a strong coffee, and grabbed something to eat before heading out to the ranch. There was work to be done. The fence needed repairs, some tools were covered in ice, and he needed to check the wood supply before the snow worsened. But as he went about his routine, he realized he wasn't alone. Zero hadn't returned to the barn. He followed him from afar, keeping a safe distance, but not completely disappearing. It was a behavior Ethan recognized well. On the battlefield, soldiers observed their leaders before trusting them. They tested their patience, their limits. Zero was doing the same. He didn't approach, but he also didn't want to be alone. It was a sign, small, almost imperceptible, but clear enough for Ethan to understand. The barrier between them was beginning to crack. The day continued with a silent routine, but one loaded with meaning. Ethan worked on the fence, replaced a few loose boards, and reinforced the weak points. He felt Zero's gaze on him the whole time. The dog kept a safe distance, not coming too close but also not leaving. It was as if he were trying to understand who that man was who had taken him from the auction. Ethan deliberately ignored the animal's presence. He didn't want Zero to feel pressured to interact, so he continued with his work, grabbed firewood, checked the supplies, and cleaned the porch as he would on any other day. It was only when the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, that Ethan finally stopped, cracked his knuckles to ease the tension in his hands, and looked in the direction of the dog. Zero was sitting near the barn, head held high, alert. They stared at each other for a brief moment, and Ethan felt something different. It wasn't just distrust, it was curiosity. When he went inside, Ethan left the door open, just as he had the previous night. He prepared dinner, a simple stew, and sat at the table to eat. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the space with a comfortable warmth. And then, in the midst of the silence, he heard the soft sound of paws on the wooden porch. He didn't immediately look up. He continued eating, pretending not to notice. Zero entered slowly, just as he had the previous night, but this time without as much hesitation. He walked to the same spot near the fireplace and lay down on the blanket. Ethan watched from the corner of his eye. The dog was still far from being domesticated, still not completely trusting, but something was different now. He wasn't just testing, he was beginning to accept. The routine repeated in the following days, but with small changes that, to Ethan, meant a lot. Zero no longer hesitated so much when entering the house with the door left open. He remained wary, always keeping a safe distance, but there was something subtly different. He wasn't just tolerating Ethan's presence, he was beginning to get used to it. During the day, they followed an almost rehearsed pattern. Ethan took care of the ranch chores, and Zero followed him from afar, never coming too close, but never leaving his sight. It was as if he were watching, making sure that that man truly did not pose a threat. Ethan respected that process. He knew that trust wasn't something imposed. It was something earned, one day at a time. On the 5th night since Zero had arrived at the ranch, something different happened. Ethan was sitting on the porch, watching the starry sky and feeling the cold wind on his face. The hot coffee mug in his hands was his only company until he heard a soft noise. He looked to the side and saw Zero approaching, not hesitantly, but with purpose. The dog stopped a few meters, Away, analyzed the situation for a moment and, for the first time, lay down next to Ethan. Not on the blanket inside the house, not in the barn, but right there beside him, on the porch. Ethan said nothing. He made no sudden movements. He simply stayed, taking a deep breath, absorbing that small moment of silent victory. Zero had made the decision on his own, and that was worth more than any command or order that could have been given. For the first time, it wasn't just a soldier rescuing a broken dog. They were two warriors, survivors, learning to trust each other. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. The house was still shrouded in twilight, and the cold of the early hours made the air almost cutting. He got up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the time spent in the armchair. When he opened the door to take a look at the ranch before making coffee, he found Zero exactly where he had left him the previous night, huddled against the wooden porch. The dog lifted his head as he noticed the movement, eyes alert, but did not move away. He simply watched, as if waiting to see what Ethan's next step would be. The ex-Marine said nothing. He just turned and went to the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a piece of dried meat and placed it on the ground near the dog without looking directly at him. It wasn't a test. It wasn't an attempt at domestication. It was a simple gesture, a recognition. Zero hesitated, sniffed the air, and after a few seconds, took the piece in his teeth and chewed it carefully. It was the first time he accepted something directly from Ethan. Throughout the day, something subtle changed. Zero still kept his distance, but Ethan noticed that the dog began to synchronize his movements with his. If Ethan walked to the barn, Zero followed a few meters behind. If he went to check the fence, the dog accompanied him, always maintaining that safe margin, but never completely disappearing. It was no longer just vigilance. It was companionship, a silent bond that was beginning to form. At the end of the afternoon, while Ethan was stacking firewood beside the house, he heard a low sound coming from the side of the ranch. When he turned, he saw Zero growling softly, body tense, eyes fixed on the road that led to the property. Ethan followed his gaze and saw a car approaching. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. The car approached slowly, kicking up a fine dust on the frozen road. It wasn't common for someone to appear without notice there. Ethan's ranch was far too remote from the town for casual visits. He dropped the logs on the ground and wiped his hands on his pants, keeping his eyes fixed on the vehicle. Zero remained tense, growling softly, body ready to react to the slightest sign of threat. When the car finally stopped in front of the house, the driver's door opened and a woman got out. Brown hair tied in a ponytail, heavy jacket for the cold, and a look that conveyed more determination than nervousness. She didn't seem hostile, but she also didn't appear to be there by chance. Ethan crossed his arms, scrutinizing her as he did with any stranger. "Can I help you?" His voice was firm, leaving no room for small talk. The woman took a few steps forward, but stopped upon noticing Zero standing next to Ethan, still in an alert position. "If he attacks me, I'd rather know now," she said, not taking her eyes off the German Shepherd. Ethan gave a slight corner smile. "He decides for himself who to attack." Zero's growl gradually subsided, but his eyes remained fixed on her, evaluating every movement. The woman sighed and pulled an envelope from her pocket. "My name is Claire Thompson. I'm a veterinarian. I work with retired military dogs." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but did not immediately reply. She held up the envelope and continued. "I heard about the auction and found out that a German Shepherd by the name of Zero was sold. I researched the records and something is wrong. This dog shouldn't have been auctioned." The silence between them grew heavy. Ethan felt his shoulders stiffen. He already knew there was something unusual about Zero. Now someone was showing proof that perhaps that dog was more than just a discarded war machine. Ethan took the envelope from Claire's hands unhurriedly, keeping his eyes on her for a few more seconds before opening it. Zero wasn't completely relaxing yet, but he no longer growled. He just watched, motionless, as if understanding that something important was happening. Ethan pulled out the papers and began reading. They were veterinary records and military documents, but some parts were blurred or deliberately hidden. He flipped through the pages until one detail caught his attention. The dog's official name wasn't Zero, it was Rex. And even stranger, there was a 6-month period completely erased from the records, as if, for some reason, the animal had simply disappeared during that time. Ethan closed the envelope and looked up at Claire. "Where did you get this?" Claire crossed her arms and took a deep breath, as if she'd expected that question. "I've been following the military dog retirement program for years. There have always been irregularities, but some are more glaring than others. This dog here," she gestured toward Zero with a slight nod, "should not have been put up for auction. He belonged to a special operations unit in Afghanistan, but he vanished from the records for a while. Then, when he reappeared, he was classified as unfit for reintegration. That makes no sense." Ethan glanced briefly at Zero, who still hadn't taken his eyes off Claire. He felt something unsettling growing inside him. There was something very wrong with that dog's history, and he had the feeling that by deciding to take him home, he had gotten involved in something much bigger than he had imagined. Ethan held the envelope for a moment before folding it and tucking it into his jacket. Pocket. His instinct told him that Claire wasn't there by chance, and that this story went far beyond simple military bureaucracy. He nodded toward the porch. "Come in." Claire hesitated for a second, then nodded, climbing the snow-covered wooden steps. Zero stayed where he was, watching her every move, still cautious. Ethan went in first, threw more wood on the fireplace, and pulled a chair for the veterinarian. He served 2 cups of coffee and sat at the table, studying Claire as she removed her gloves and grabbed the hot drink. "Why does this matter so much to you?" he asked directly. Claire blew on her coffee before answering. "Because I've seen dogs discarded by the system before. But this case is different. They didn't just get rid of him. They erased his existence." Ethan twirled the cup between his hands, absorbing that. It wasn't news that the government buried inconvenient information. "But why a dog?" Claire continued. "I tried to find more details about those missing 6 months, but all I got was a name, Major James Harrison." The name made Ethan immediately look up. He knew Harrison, not personally, but from rumors. An officer who operated behind the scenes, involved in projects that never saw the light of day. Extreme training, unrecorded missions, experiments to create tougher soldiers, and now, apparently, war dogs. He leaned forward a bit. "Are you sure about that?" Claire nodded. It was the only name that came up linked to Rex. But if Harrison was involved, then this dog went through something that no one should know about. The silence between them grew heavy. Ethan glanced at Zero, who lay near the fireplace, eyes half closed but still alert. That animal wasn't just a discarded dog. He was a key piece in something much bigger, and if Major Harrison wanted him to disappear, it meant he knew too much. Ethan reclined in his chair, feeling the weight of that revelation settle in his mind like a problem that couldn't be ignored. He had seen it all during his time in the Marines, but a military dog with a 6-month gap in the records and the name of a controversial major attached to him. That was another story. Claire finished her coffee and set her cup on the table, looking directly at him. "I don't know exactly what happened to Rex during that time, but I know he went through something no one wants to come to light." Ethan looked at Zero. The German Shepherd didn't react, but his body was slightly tense, as if understanding that they were talking about him. Claire continued, "If Harrison was truly involved, then this dog saw something he shouldn't have. And now that he's with you, you're on their radar too." Ethan didn't like the direction that conversation was taking. He took the envelope from his pocket and ran his fingers over the paper, absorbing the information. "And what do you expect me to do?" Claire took a deep breath. "Find out what happened to him. And if there's anything dirty in this story, expose it." Ethan let out a low, humorless laugh. "Do you have any idea who we're dealing with? If Harrison wanted to ensure this story stayed buried, he would have already done so." Claire didn't blink. "Maybe he thinks he has. But this dog is still here. The problem is, now that you have him, he might decide to end his service. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked again at Zero and saw something in the dog's eyes he had never noticed before. Something beyond distrust or trauma. Something that looked very much like a warning, as if the animal itself knew that danger was coming. Ethan stayed silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of the situation settle in his chest like a tight armor. He wasn't the type to get involved in problems he couldn't solve. He had spent years in active duty, learning to identify battles worth fighting and those that only led to destruction. But now, standing there, facing Zero and feeling the gravity in Claire's gaze, he realized that the decision had been made the moment he raised his hand at the auction. No matter what Harrison had done or was trying to hide, he wasn't going to give that dog up. He let out a long sigh and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. If I go after this, I need to know exactly where I'm stepping. Do you have anything else besides the name Harrison? Claire hesitated for a second, then took her cell phone, swiping through the screen before turning the device toward him. I have a widow, Sarah Baker. Her husband was a Marine lieutenant. Before he died, he wrote about irregularities in the military dog training program. Ethan took the phone and examined a photo of a digital newspaper clipping. The headline mentioned Lieutenant Baker's death during an operation in Afghanistan, but the article said nothing about investigations, nothing beyond the standard narrative of a soldier fallen in combat. But if he really knew something, and now he was dead, then this story was even bigger than Ethan imagined. He handed the phone back to Claire and rubbed his face. Zero shifted on the rug near the fireplace, raising his head for a moment before settling back down, but his ears were alert. Does she know anything? Ethan asked. Claire shrugged. She suspects. Her husband left some notes before he was killed, but he never managed to prove anything. She tried talking to other soldiers from his unit, but no one would speak up. Ethan let out a dry laugh. Of course not. If Harrison was involved, it means that anyone who talks might end up on the same path. Claire nodded. Exactly. But if anyone can extract the truth from this story, that someone is you. Ethan drummed his fingers on the table, evaluating the information he had. It wasn't enough. There were still many gaps, and any misstep could put them on the radar of people who wouldn't hesitate to silence them. He looked at Claire, who was waiting for an answer. If I go to Sarah Baker, I need to have something concrete to offer. Can't just show up and ask about her husband. Claire nodded in agreement. I can help with that. I have access to some records that aren't available to the public. If there's something buried in those documents, I can find it. Ethan was silent for a moment, then nodded. Then find it. He got up, grabbed his coat, and cast a glance at Zero, who was now watching them intently, head slightly tilted. The dog seemed to sense that something was changing, that something was about to happen. Ethan wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a warning that they were about to dive into something dangerous. Claire said her goodbyes shortly after, promising to get in touch as soon as she had something concrete. Ethan stayed on the porch, watching her car disappear down the snow-covered road. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, feeling the biting cold on his face. When he returned inside, Zero was still lying near the fireplace, but his eyes followed him. Ethan picked up a piece of dried meat and tossed it to him. Zero caught it mid-air and chewed slowly. Looks like we're in for something big, partner, Ethan murmured, pulling the armchair closer to the fire. He knew sleepless nights were coming. He knew that by choosing to follow this trail, he was opening a door that might never close. But now, it was too late to turn back. He wasn't the type of man who ran from a fight, and by the looks of it, neither was Zero. The next day, Ethan decided to act. He wasn't a man who liked to wait for answers to fall into his lap, and if there was one thing he had learned in the army, it was that the longer someone stayed still, the more vulnerable they became. He picked up the phone and called an old Marine contact, a guy to whom he owed some favors and who could help him find out more about Harrison without raising suspicions. The call was short and to the point. I need everything you can find on the advanced military dog training program. Anything related to Harrison? Can you do that? On the other end, the man hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. Are you sure you want to mess with this? Ethan frowned. If I had a choice, I wouldn't be calling. There was a brief silence, then the answer came. I'll see what I can do, but this might take some time. Ethan thanked him and hung up. He didn't expect quick answers, but at least now something was in motion. While waiting, he decided to head into town to take care of a few things, and perhaps watch for any strange movements. If Harrison really wanted this story buried, it wouldn't be long before he noticed someone digging where they shouldn't. He called for Zero to get into the car, but as always, the dog hesitated for a moment before obeying. The difference now was subtle, yet noticeable. He didn't get in solely out of obligation, but because he was beginning to accept Ethan as part of his new reality. The drive was quiet, the roads covered by a white blanket of snow that reflected the pale morning sun. Upon arriving in town, Ethan parked near the market and got out, leaving the car window slightly open for Zero. The town was small and quiet, but he knew that any place could turn into a battlefield if the wrong person was lurking. He grabbed the groceries quickly, and as he left, felt that old instinct awaken. Someone was watching him. Ethan kept a neutral expression, but his senses were on high alert. Years of service had taught him to recognize when he was being watched. He didn't immediately turn his head or look for suspicious faces. Instead, he walked calmly to the car, tossed the bags into the back seat, and pretended to check his cell phone. From the reflection in the window, he saw a man on the other side of the street, leaning against a light post, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses, something unusual for a cold, overcast day. The man didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, but there was something in his posture that didn't match the town's peaceful environment. He wasn't a local, that much was clear. Ethan sighed, lightly tapped the car's hood, and opened the door. In the back seat, Zero was already standing, eyes fixed in the same direction. The dog had sensed the threat as well. This confirmed Ethan's suspicions. Without showing any haste, he got into the car and started the engine. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the man was no longer there. He had disappeared among the few pedestrians walking on the sidewalk. Ethan left the parking spot and drove slowly down the main avenue, alert to any sign that he was being followed. But nothing seemed amiss. Still, his instinct screamed that it wasn't a coincidence. The auction had taken place less than a week ago, and suddenly a suspicious person was watching his movements. Harrison, or someone connected to him, already knew that Ethan was asking too many questions. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and quickly glanced at Zero, whose eyes remained fixed on the street. Looks like we already have. Company, partner. The German Shepherd didn't react, but Ethan knew that if the threat got too close, Zero would be ready. Ethan drove back to the ranch in silence, feeling the tension growing in his chest. He didn't like coincidences, and that situation reeked of trouble. If someone was already watching his steps, it meant he didn't have much time before things escalated. As soon as he entered the dirt road leading to the property, he looked in the rearview mirror once more. Nothing. No car. Behind, no suspicious movement, but that didn't mean he was safe. When he stopped the car in front of the house, Zero was the first to get out. The dog leaped from the back seat and sniffed the air, alert to any change in the environment. Ethan grabbed the bags and went inside, but left the door unlocked. He didn't want to feel trapped inside his own house in case he needed to react quickly. He organized the supplies in the kitchen, and even before taking off his coat, pulled out the envelope Claire had given him and opened it again. He skimmed through the documents, trying to find something he might have missed before. Rex, or Zero, had an impressive history as a military dog, but the 6-month gap remained a mystery. Harrison's name was the only concrete piece in that mess, and that meant if he wanted answers, he needed to start there. Ethan picked up his cell phone and hesitated before dialing. The contact he'd called earlier for information still hadn't gotten back to him, and he knew pressing him could draw attention, but he had to move. He sent a short message. Anything on Harrison, let me know as soon as you can. Then he tossed the phone onto the table and rubbed his face. Zero was sitting near the door, watching him with those alert eyes, as if sensing that something big was about to happen. "I think we're in for trouble, boy," Ethan murmured, and for the first time, Zero didn't look away. Night fell quickly, bringing with it an even more intense cold. Ethan made a strong coffee and sat at the table, eyes fixed on the fire in the fireplace, while his mind worked incessantly. He had been in dangerous situations before, dealt with threats that needed to be eliminated before they turned into bigger problems. But this time was different. This time he wasn't in a battlefield surrounded by allies. This time he was alone, or almost. He shifted his gaze to Zero, who remained near the door, alert, as if feeling the tension in the air. The silence between them was almost comfortable. No words were needed. Both knew they were on the brink of something bigger than they could control. Ethan let out a long sigh and turned his coffee cup, feeling the warmth trickle down his throat. Tomorrow, he would look for Sarah Baker. Sleep came in fragments, as always. Shattered dreams, confused memories, the echo of distant explosions that no longer existed but still lived within him. In the middle of the night, he suddenly woke up, muscles tense, heart pounding. For a second, he wasn't sure what had awakened him. Then he heard it, a noise outside, subtle but real. Ethan froze, holding his breath to listen better. Zero was already standing, body rigid, eyes fixed on the door, as if he knew exactly what was happening. The dog didn't growl, but his posture said it all. Someone was outside. Ethan moved slowly, grabbed the gun he kept on the bedside table, and walked to the door, without turning on any light. The darkness was his ally. He pressed his face against the wood and waited. Another sound, footsteps in the snow, and then a shadow moved in the yard. Ethan felt his body switch to combat mode automatically. Adrenaline surged through his veins, bringing back a clarity he hadn't felt in ages. Gripping the gun firmly, he slid over to the window next to the door and peered through a gap in the curtain. The shadow moved slowly, cautiously. It wasn't an animal. It was someone who knew how to approach without attracting attention. Someone trained. The ranch was large, but anyone arriving there at that hour, without lights on and without a visible car, wasn't there by accident. Zero remained motionless beside Ethan, breathing steadily, muscles tense. The German shepherd made no sound, but his eyes were fixed on the door. He too sensed the threat. Ethan waited a bit longer, studying the intruder. The man stopped a few meters from the house and crouched, as if examining something on the ground. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. That was enough. Ethan opened the door with a swift movement, pointing the gun directly at the man. "Hands where I can see them." His voice was firm, leaving no room for question. The stranger froze for a second before raising his hands, but Ethan noticed he didn't seem surprised. That was a bad sign. "I didn't come looking for trouble," the man said in a low, controlled voice. Ethan kept his aim steady. "Then you chose the wrong place for a midnight stroll." The man quickly glanced at Zero, who was now growling low, ready to attack at the slightest threat. "If I wanted to catch you off guard, I would have come another way." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" The man slowly lowered his hands and pointed his chin toward his jacket pocket. "I have something for you. May I take it?" Ethan hesitated for a second before nodding. The stranger produced a crumpled envelope and tossed it on the ground. "Harrison already knows you're after him. This might help you understand who you're dealing with." Ethan did not lower his gun. He knew this kind of game all too well. Information never came free. He kept his eyes fixed on the stranger for a few more seconds before stepping forward and picking up the envelope from the ground, still on guard. The paper was damp from the cold, folded several times as if it had been carried for a long time. Zero still growled low, not taking his eyes off the man. Ethan opened the envelope with one hand and pulled out the contents. They were copies of military documents, but unlike the records Claire had obtained, these contained details that had previously been hidden. There were reports about dogs used in extreme endurance tests, advanced conditioning methods, and a list of names linked to the project. Ethan quickly flipped through the pages until he found something that made his stomach turn. Rex's name was there, his identification number, his recorded missions, and finally, a short note beside the erased 6-month period. Classified. Restricted access. Harrison's directive. He looked up at the man. "Who gave you this?" The stranger let out a short, humorless laugh. "Someone who doesn't want to see Harrison win this war." Ethan scrutinized the man more closely. He seemed to have been a military man, perhaps still was. There was something in the way he stood, keeping his breathing controlled, even with a gun pointed at him. "If Harrison already knows I'm after him, why am I still alive?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Because he wants to see how far you'll go. But this won't last long." He took a step back, his eyes briefly shifting to Zero before returning to Ethan. "I'm not your enemy, but if I were you, I'd end this investigation before he decides he's had enough." The stranger retreated a few more steps in the snow, then turned and vanished into the night's darkness. Ethan stood there, immobile, feeling the weight of the paper between his fingers. Zero slowly approached and sniffed the envelope, as if he, too, could sense that it was more than just paper. Ethan went back inside and locked the door behind him. The cold seemed to have seeped into his bones, but it wasn't just because of the temperature outside. He sat at the table and spread the documents out before him, scrutinizing every detail. The reports were precise, clinical, devoid of any trace of humanity. They listed numbers, dates, statistics about the dogs used in the experimental program. What struck him the most were the notes about the so-called advanced instinct suppression training. It was a method aimed at transforming the dogs into completely controllable weapons, eliminating natural reactions like fear, hesitation, or even loyalty. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He had heard rumors about such projects before, but had never seen anything concrete. Now he had proof in his hands. And Rex's name, Zero, was right there, listed as one of the test subjects. He ran his fingers over the paper, feeling anger rising within him. What had they done to that dog? What kind of abuse was necessary to try to erase the instinct of an animal trained to protect? Ethan looked at Zero, who was now lying near the fireplace, watching him with those intelligent, deep eyes, as if he knew exactly what was happening. He let out a long sigh and rubbed his face. The problem was that knowing the truth changed nothing. Harrison was still in control. He was still a powerful man with connections at the highest levels, and if he was already monitoring his steps, it meant time was running out. Ethan picked up the cell phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. He needed backup. The phone rang 3 times before being answered. The voice on the other end was rough, direct, the kind of tone that only someone who had spent too much time in combat zones would develop. "Walker, I thought you disappeared from the map." Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need information, and maybe a favor." The silence on the other end was brief but heavy. "Is this about the name you sent earlier?" Ethan squinted. "It is, and the more I find out, the less I like it." A dry laugh came almost immediately. "If Harrison is involved, then you're already on the wrong trail. This guy has had free rein for years. What exactly do you want to know?" Ethan looked at the papers spread out on the table and rubbed his face. "I want to know what happened during the erased period in the military dog Rex's records." The silence on the other end stretched for a few seconds. "You're not going to like the answer." Ethan took a deep breath. "I figured as much." The sound of keys being pressed came through the line, and then the voice returned, now more serious. "What I've found so far isn't official, but there are records of a select group of dogs that went through experimental evaluations. The details were removed from the reports, but the names of those dogs appeared in missions that shouldn't even exist on paper." Ethan clenched his fist. He knew what that meant. They were used as disposable weapons. The man on the other end sighed. "Seems so, but Rex, he's a different case. He disappeared from the list before the program was deactivated. He wasn't discarded. He was pulled out, as if someone intervened. Ethan looked at Zero, who was now sitting, watching him intently. So someone tried to save him. The answer was short. Or tried to hide something much worse. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing those words. If someone had pulled Rex out of the program before he was completely discarded, there were two possible motives. Either they wanted to protect him from something terrible, or he was a piece who knew too much and needed to disappear. Either way, it didn't smell right. "Can you find out who did it?" he asked, trying to keep his mind cool. The man on the other end of the line snorted. "If you find out, it's going to cost you a favor you won't like to pay later." Ethan squinted and rubbed the back of his neck. "Let me know as soon as you have something." The call ended, and he stood there, holding the phone, feeling that he had just crossed a point of no return. Zero got up and walked over to him, stopping at the table's side. His dark eyes were fixed on Ethan, as if trying to decipher what was happening. Without much thought, Ethan reached out and slowly ran his fingers over the dog's head. It was the first time Zero allowed contact without recoiling. A small step forward, but in that moment, it meant a lot. "Looks like you're more valuable than I thought, boy." Zero continued watching him without moving. The fire in the fireplace crackled in the background, and for the first time since that nightmare began, Ethan felt that he wasn't completely alone in this fight, but he knew that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. Harrison already knew he was investigating. It was only a matter of time before he decided to act. The next morning, Ethan decided it. It was time to find Sarah Baker. He couldn't wait for the pieces to fall into place on their own. He had to act before Harrison or anyone else involved got ahead. He took the address Claire had given him and put Zero in the car. The dog moved more naturally in the vehicle now, although still maintaining a vigilant posture. The drive to Sarah's house was several hours away, and the overcast sky indicated more snow was on the way. Ethan drove in silence, thoughts spinning endlessly. If her husband really knew something about Harrison's program, then perhaps the answers he needed were there. But that also meant Sarah might be in danger, and if Harrison already knew Ethan was after her. When he arrived at the address, he found a simple house, isolated and surrounded by trees. It looked too peaceful, but Ethan knew that didn't guarantee safety. He parked and observed the entrance for a few moments before getting out of the car. Zero stayed alert in the back seat, ears pricked. Ethan went to the door and knocked twice. No answer. He waited a few seconds and knocked again. This time, soft footsteps came from the other side. The door slowly opened, revealing a woman with tired eyes, features marked by time and pain. "Are you Ethan Walker?" she asked bluntly. He nodded. "Claire told me about you." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, as if checking that no one else was around, then opened the door a little wider. "Come in." Ethan didn't hesitate. He could feel that something was off. The interior of the house was modest but well organized. There were old photographs in worn frames over the fireplace, and Ethan noticed one in particular, a man in uniform, smiling next to a German shepherd, very much like Zero. He approached, picked up the frame, and studied the image for a moment. "Is that Rex?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the photo. Sarah closed the door behind him and nodded slowly. "Yes. My husband David trained him. They were inseparable for years." There was a weight in her voice, a tone of longing mixed with something deeper, perhaps guilt. Ethan put the photo back and turned to face her. "You said your husband wrote about irregularities in the military dog program. What exactly did he find out?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then walked to a drawer, opened it, and took out a worn notebook. She handed it to Ethan, who quickly flipped through it. The pages were filled with detailed accounts of the brutal treatment the dogs endured. Extreme endurance, exercises, isolation, food deprivation to stimulate aggression. But one particular passage caught Ethan's attention. Harrison isn't just training dogs. He's conditioning them so they feel no fear, pain, or loyalty. He wants to create weapons that never hesitate. Ethan felt a chill down his spine. He had seen men broken by similar indoctrination, but never dogs. Sarah continued. David tried to report it, but no one would listen. So he started gathering evidence. Shortly before his last mission, he told me he had found something big, something that would prove it all, but he died before he could expose it. Ethan closed the notebook and looked at her. And that evidence? Did he leave anything behind? Sarah took a deep breath. I don't know. But if something exists, the only clue I have is at the base where he served. That's where it all started. Ethan processed that information cautiously. If the evidence was at the base where David served, he'd have to find a way to access it without drawing attention. He knew that a military installation wasn't a place where someone just showed up and started asking questions. Is that base still active? He asked, closing the notebook. Sarah nodded. Yes, but it was reconfigured in recent years. Most operations were transferred, but some old files must have been kept. Ethan exhaled. That meant he'd have to act fast and precisely. I need to know exactly where to look. Any contact inside who can help us? Sarah shook her head. After David's death, no one wanted to get involved. All I could find out was through public records and the notes he left behind. If there's something there, it's well hidden. Ethan understood what that meant. He would have to infiltrate without permission. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. Zero, who had stayed outside the house, was now on the porch, sitting, staring directly at the door, as if sensing the tension of the moment. Ethan looked at Sarah and saw the fear hidden beneath her determination. If I do this, it might draw attention to you. If Harrison suspects we're too close, he might try to silence you. Sarah lifted her chin slightly, her eyes firm. I've spent the last few years living in fear. I'm not going to spend another day pretending that my husband died for nothing. Ethan held her gaze for a moment before nodding. Then I'll go to that base. He picked up the notebook and tucked it in his pocket. But I need a safe entry, and for that, I'll need help. Ethan left Sarah's house feeling the weight of the mission he had just undertaken. He knew that entering a military base without authorization was a death sentence, but staying still was not an option. When he reached his car, Zero was still in the same spot on the porch, as if he had been waiting for him all along. The dog got up as soon as Ethan approached and entered the vehicle without hesitation. That was already a sign of progress. On the way back, Ethan picked up the phone and called Claire. As soon as she answered, he got straight to the point. I need a way to get into that base. There was a brief silence before she replied. This isn't a joke, Walker. You know that if you're caught, there's no turning back. Ethan exhaled. I know, but if there's evidence inside, I need to find it before Harrison erases it. Claire sighed on the other end. I can try to get you a fake authorization, but that takes time. The other option, well, it's risky. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Tell me. One of the veterinarians who worked with Rex still has access to the base. He isn't part of the scheme, but he saw things he didn't like. I tried to convince him to talk before, but he was scared. Maybe now, with the evidence we have, he'll agree to help. Ethan considered the idea. Having an insider could be his best chance. Where do I find him? Claire hesitated before replying. He lives out of town, on an isolated property. If you go to talk to him, be careful. He doesn't like surprises. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at Zero, who was now watching the road intently. Don't worry, neither do I. He ended the call and accelerated. If this veterinarian really had information that could help him get into the base, then that was his next stop. But something inside him said that Harrison already knew he was getting close, and it wouldn't be long before he reacted. The road to the veterinarian's property was long and deserted, winding through snow-covered hills and forests dimmed by winter. Ethan kept a vigilant eye on the rearview mirror the entire time, looking for any sign of being followed. Zero, in the back seat, seemed equally alert, as if sensing the tension in the air. When he finally spotted the house, a weathered wooden building surrounded by a makeshift fence, Ethan slowed down and surveyed the area. Everything was too quiet. No smoke rising from the chimney, no light on, no sign of activity. He parked the car at a safe distance and observed for a moment. He didn't like it. Something was wrong. He grabbed the gun from the glove compartment and got out of the vehicle slowly, with Zero right behind him, the dog's muscles tense, ready to react. They advanced cautiously through the entrance, treading on the soft snow without making much noise. Ethan knocked on the door 3 times and waited. Nothing. He tried again. Silence. His jaw clenched, and he already knew what would follow. With a quick motion, he turned the doorknob, locked. He stepped back and kicked the door forcefully. The wood gave way with a sharp crack, and he entered with the gun in hand, scanning the area. The house was ransacked, papers scattered on the floor, chairs knocked over, signs of a struggle. Zero entered right behind him, sniffing the air rapidly. Ethan didn't need more than a few seconds to understand what had happened. Someone had gotten there before him, and it seemed they didn't just want to scare the veterinarian, they wanted to silence him. He moved down the narrow hallway and found the answer at the last door. The man's body lay on the floor, a clean shot to the head. Ethan felt his jaw lock. Harrison was already cleaning up his tracks. Ethan looked around, assessing the scene. It was an execution, swift and precise. There was no torture, no sign of prolonged struggle. The veterinarian never had a chance. Harrison wanted to send a clear message. Anyone who knew too much would pay with their life. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his mind clear. He had seen this kind of murder before, had come across bodies of people who knew too much, but now it was right at his doorstep. If he hadn't taken so long to arrive, could he have done something? He pushed that thought away. There was no room for regrets now. The focus was on discovering if the veterinarian left anything behind, any clue, any file, anything that could help them understand what really happened. To Rex, Zero sniffed the ground intently, following an invisible trail. Ethan trusted the dog's instinct. If there was something there, Zero would find it. He followed the German shepherd to a corner of the room where a piece of furniture had been knocked over. There were marks on the floor, as if something had been dragged. Ethan knelt down and began moving the objects until he found a small metal compartment built into the wood. It was locked. He frowned, took a knife from his pocket, and forced the lock. With a snap, the lid opened, revealing a USB drive and a small notepad. He took both and quickly tucked them into his jacket pocket. If Harrison had killed the veterinarian, it was because that man still had something worth hiding. Now, Ethan needed to get out of there before the hitmen decided to return to ensure the job was done. Ethan left the house as quickly as he had entered, keeping the gun in hand while scanning the perimeter. His instincts told him he shouldn't linger. Zero was restless, the fur along his back slightly raised, as if sensing that something was about to happen. Ethan closed the door behind him, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. He grabbed his cell phone and called Claire while briskly walking back to the car. As soon as she answered, he got straight to the point. Harrison beat me to it. The veterinarian is dead. The silence on the other end was short but heavy. Damn. Claire exhaled forcefully. And you? Did you get anything? Ethan tossed the USB drive onto the passenger seat and started the engine. Maybe. I need you to check what's on here. Claire hesitated before replying. If Harrison ordered that man's death, it means what he had was important. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror before speeding away. Exactly. And now we have that information. The drive back was tense. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, checking for any sign he might be followed, but the road remained deserted. That worried him. Harrison wasn't the type to leave loose ends. If he knew Ethan was getting too close, he would already be preparing his next move. When Ethan finally reached the ranch, he got out of the car quickly and took Zero inside, locking the doors behind him. He placed the USB drive and the notepad on the table. Claire would arrive soon to help decipher the data, but for now, he focused on the notebook. The notes were chaotic, as if the veterinarian had written them in a rush. But among the scribbles and incomplete phrases, Ethan found something that took his breath away. Rex didn't forget. He remembered. Ethan looked at Zero, who now stared back at him with those intelligent, inscrutable eyes. What exactly did that dog remember? Time seemed to slow down. Ethan stared at the note in the notebook, feeling an unease growing within him. He remembered. Remembered what? He knew Harrison wanted Rex erased from history, but now the question was different. What exactly had they done to that dog for? His memory to be a problem. He slid his fingers over the page, trying to find more clues among the veterinarian's rushed words. But before he could delve any deeper, he heard the sound of a car approaching. His body reacted automatically. He grabbed the gun from the table and positioned himself by the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. It was Claire. Time was up. Harrison noticed the distraction for a second and smiled. You should have chosen the easier option. Then with a quick movement, he pulled a small device from his pocket. Ethan barely had time to register what it was before Harrison pressed the button, and the car he had arrived in exploded in a wave of fire and twisted metal. The impact of the explosion sent a wave of heat and shrapnel through the air, causing Ethan to dive to the ground to avoid the worst. Zero quickly retreated, his fur bristling, growling loudly. As the ball of fire illuminated the surrounding snow, Harrison used the moment to retreat, sprinting toward one of the vehicles that was still intact. Ethan got up quickly, ignoring the ringing in his ears, and fired in his direction. The first shot ricocheted off the car's hood, the second shattered the side window, but Harrison was already inside the vehicle, accelerating away with all its might. Ethan cursed, but didn't waste time. He ran back to the house, throwing the door open in one swift motion. "Claire!" His voice was strong, mixed with the smoke that began, seeping through the wide-open door. Claire was lying beside the table, the notebook on the floor, its screen flickering. Ethan rushed to her and helped her up. "Did you manage?" he asked, holding her by the shoulders. Claire blinked a few times, stunned by the explosion, then nodded, panting. "Yes, I sent it to multiple servers. It's done." Ethan let out a heavy sigh, feeling for the first time in a long while that they had managed to turn the tables, but they were not out of danger yet. Outside, the flames of the burning car lit up the ranch like a beacon, a clear sign that something had happened there. They needed to leave before reinforcements arrived. Ethan grabbed the notebook and stuffed it into a backpack. Then he looked at Claire and Zero. "Let's go. We've just put a target on our backs." Without waiting for a reply, he led them out. Now it was only a matter of time before Harrison realized he had lost. Ethan drove without looking back. The ranch, his refuge for so long, was now a battlefield marked by fire and blood. But he couldn't hold on to anything there anymore. His only focus was keeping Claire and Zero alive and ensuring that the video continued to spread. The road cut through the darkness like a solitary thread, and every distant headlight seemed like a threat. Claire remained silent for a while, taking deep breaths to compose herself. "Do you think he'll run?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Harrison is too proud to run, but now he knows he can't. Avoid this. The longer time passes, the more people will see what he did. Claire glanced at Zero in the back seat. The German shepherd was lying there, exhausted, but his eyes were still alert, as if he knew the fight wasn't over yet. Hours later, when they reached Ethan's meeting point with his contact, the confirmation came. The video had already spread through military forums, independent journalists, and even networks of ex-soldiers. The truth was out of Harrison's control. He might have power and influence, but not even he could bury something the whole world had seen. Ethan pulled over and let out a long sigh, feeling for the first time in a long while that he had done something right. Claire received a message and looked at him with a tired smile. He's gone. No word of Harrison since the video was published. Ethan slowly nodded. The man who tried to turn soldiers and dogs into soulless machines was now a ghost, hiding while desperately trying to erase his tracks. He looked at Zero, who now stared back at him and patted the dog's head. "It's over, boy. You don't have to run anymore." The following days were a blur of calls, headlines, and investigations. The scandal exploded on a national scale. Military reports began to leak, reinforcing the video's evidence. Harrison, once untouchable, was now a hunted man, forced to hide while desperately trying to erase his tracks. High-ranking officers tried to downplay the impact, but it was too late. The public already knew. Veterans, those who truly understood the weight of what had been done, demanded justice, and justice was coming. Claire received confirmation that formal investigations were being opened against those responsible for the program, and Ethan knew that this time there was no turning back. He had done what needed to be done. But for him, the true victory wasn't in the courts or the headlines. It was there, in the form of a German shepherd that now roamed freely on the ranch of a new property he and Claire had acquired. With the money he received as compensation for everything he had been through, Ethan created the Second Chance Canine Rehabilitation Center, where retired military dogs would be treated with respect and reintegrated in a dignified manner. Zero, now renamed Shadow, became the symbol of that place, a living testament to resistance and redemption. He was still a warrior, but now he fought a different battle, teaching others that there was life beyond combat. And, for Ethan, that was the greatest proof that even after war, it was still possible to find purpose.